Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. It's a true pleasure to have you here at the Stimson Center today. And thank you so much for joining us for what I know will be a timely and thought-provoking conversation. My name is Julian Müller-Kahler, and I direct our Strategic Foresight program here at the Center. Today, we want to launch Tech Cold War, the Geopolitics of Technology, a new book that really explores one of the most defining dynamics of our time, I think. The growing convergence of technological innovation and geopolitics. Not too long ago, technological development was mostly seen as an economic and commercial issue. But today, I think it is clear to everyone that high tech has come to define high politics too. From AI and semiconductors to 5G and quantum computing, technology is now deeply entangled in questions of national power, global influence, and strategic resilience. These days, it really feels like a tech breakthrough comes with both a product launch and a press conference at the Pentagon. Nowhere is this interconnection more evident than in the ongoing competition between the United States and China. A rivalry that is shaping not only markets and supply chains, but also norms, questions of global governance, and the future of international relations. In the last Cold War, we raced to the moon. In the new Cold War, we raced to secure supply chains and the best AI chips. Here at the Stimson Center, we aim to bring clarity to complexity for now more than 35 years. We are an independent, non-partisan think tank dedicated to advancing international peace and security through practical policy solutions. And a big part of that mission involves anticipating global trends, fostering dialogues like the one that we do here, particularly among also emerging technologies. So we are really honored to the authors of Tech Cold War, Ansgar Bauns, who is one of our and a fellow German, and Nicholas Butts, whose insights are grounded in both analysis as well as practical experience. Their book helps illuminate how Geotech statecraft has shaped over the last 15 years and what it might mean for the future. Now, for those of you who want to learn more and are intrigued by the conversation, you can actually purchase the book outside and importantly, at a very distinct discount. So you have to make the promise that you refrain from reselling the copies that you acquire. With that, I want to thank you all again very much for being here. There will be time for Q&A after an initial discussion, both online as well as on-site. And without any further ado, I want to hand it over to our moderator, Helen Sang, who's the co-founder of Intrigue Media. And she is a geotech expert herself, an ex-Googler, a former Australian diplomat, a Mandarin interpreter, not just translator, and most importantly, of course, Fulbrighter. So, Helen, please take it from here.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us here for this excellent discussion. To come and moderate accepted because I know it's a defining feature of our a lot of information flooded and a lot of disruption certainly to the I think in some ways has disrupted order that they set up in 80 days that they took 80 years to set up, right? So I think a lot of this is very is about all these things going on with tariffs and other all these other distractions is that the long-term play is the tech Cold War. That's why I'm so pleased that we're joining these two on stage today to talk about this missing businesses think facts actually operate. Really pleased to throw the floor over to you two to start with. Tell us all, why are you two, who are tech execs, even writing about geopolitics? Why not write about something a little bit more, snazzy with it and keeping up with Silicon Valley? Why geopolitics?
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure. Yeah, why did we? I think we could answer on a couple of levels. So one is our political scientists, international relations, and for some time there was a huge gap between what we actually were trained to do. There was literally no connection between the two worlds. We would try to discuss international in a tech company. You would find, bored faces, awkwardness. Really, companies operated on that international matter anymore. We state the security thing that was dear to a political scientist really matter. And to the world. And then we felt over the last years that two very, very quickly. And it's interesting, we draw back to what we learned about structural realism and apply it actually today to management. Going right, let's say, this kind of does it really connect? That's basically the level of it. Then on the more abstract or analytical level, we felt that there is understandings on both sides. So there's certainly corporations do not get. So we see corporations still operating on the assumption of what we call the unipolar moment, like Charles Krauthammer called it, like this very unique moment in history where you had a unipolar world after 1990.
That's right.
Tech companies thought that's the norm, that's the baseline, and they don't get that the new world that we are in, not a short period that you can see through, but that's the new normal to manage. That's the misunderstanding on the corporate side. On the policy bubble side, I'd say we also problems. One is the policy bubble, how corporations are reacting to and geopolitically motivated regulation. Two, the policy bubble doesn't really get how innovation is working and how fluid innovation is, and that you cannot apply the choke point theory to a very fluid innovation system. And number three is we had the feeling that China is misunderstood, particularly the innovation ecosystem, which is not top-down. It's not a president deciding everything in China, but you have a tech ecosystem that's very, very agile. And we predicted when we wrote the book and in articles that there will be ugly surprises. We create basically, we gave China something that they lacked before, which was necessity, for example, on high-end semiconductors. And once you added that to the innovation ecosystem in China, it really took off. So we felt on both sides there are problems, right? So we need to talk more to each other and not only with our corporate space, but try to connect both worlds. And voila, I think the book is our attempt to somewhat build some bridge.
Here we are. I do want to go back to those 2 points later on because I think there's a lot to unpack here and I want to make sure the audience full enjoyment from both these authors. But Nick, I want to turn to you now to think about, bring us up to speed about where we are today. What is this Cold War, which sometimes, I'm not sure if Cold War is necessarily always the right framing, but I remember reading about Made in China 2025 back in 2017 and thinking, what on earth is this? And yet here we are. So let's zoom out a little bit for the audience and bring us up to where we are today.
Totally, and I think we called this out and we call out the Cold War analogy specifically, and I'll get back to why we think that it's a useful lens actually. So first and foremost, it's not new that governments have interfered in private corporations and with, to Julian's point early, like for economic measures, for defense purposes. I think what we saw after the end of the Cold War, as Ansgar said, end of history theory that extended into Silicon Valley. And you see that in the creation of the digital tech companies that we know today, which were created with this belief that there was no national borders. Right? And so some of the biggest tech companies that we have today are created thinking that the internet would have sort of circumvented that. And what we're seeing now is this geopolitical reality check, if you will. You can see that if you take a corporate, Google, Facebook both tried to enter China for a while. OpenAI didn't even bother. And so shift between 25 ago into today. And what we call in the book Geotech statecraft is essentially this attempt by governments to manage national security externalities. And we trace it back, starting with some of the Chinese industrial policy that we've seen. China entered the WTO, but then also with the Snowden revelation in the U.S. that sort of had a glow up or a blow up again recently. China's made in China 2025 plan, Belt One Road strategy, and then what we saw unfold Trump 1 and the U.S.-China trade war originally, continued by the Biden administration around export controls. And of this, what we claim is a quote-unquote tech Cold War that's dominated by a systemic rivalry between two different systems. They're not necessarily ideological competing systems as directly as during the Cold War, but they are separate systems. We have this security dilemma where and I think true today as we see unfold day to day, it's impossible to tell what are defensive and what are offensive reactions in this tit-for-tat dynamic that we now have between the U.S. and China. And then finally, for us, we see that manifest in this tech space, in quantum. But 1.0. The main strategy that the president took then was moving away from the allied approach and having sort of U.S. go at it a bit alone. But what we compliment the president for back then was very clear stated goals around what they wanted to achieve, essentially decrease the trade deficit. Now, you can argue whether that's a good goal or it was a very clearly stated goal that they wanted to achieve. The Biden administration took a more sensible approach from our perspective around making sure that you align with your allies and coordinate some of your response with your allies and double down on that. What the Biden administration didn't do well, and we outlined, is having clear yardsticks. Like if you go back to like reading anything that came out of the Biden White House, what was it that they wanted China to do? What were the specific yardsticks that they would like to see from China? And I think speaking to a lot of folks in China for the book also, that was very unclear to the Chinese in terms of how to navigate the relationship. And I think that unfolded. You know, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan talked about small yard, high fence, and that was sort of the strategy from the U.S. We see that as fundamentally misunderstanding how technology works. You cannot maintain a small yard because what you're seeing today is everything is being securitized. It used to be only chips. Now it's chips and AI. Soon it'll be chips, AI, and energy. And then it'll be tech, climate tech, et cetera, et cetera. So everything becomes about national security. So the yard is always expanding. And the high fence, there's a lot of holes in the fence. Even if you have restrictions, companies will find ways to evade those, or they will find ways to like work around it. And on the Chinese side, you see the same thing. For chips, you see, to Ansgar's point, like Chinese innovation driving around that. DeepSeek is a great example of compute restrictions focusing on one specific area of technology and then being circumvented by innovation in how to leverage compute for inference and training for AI-specific products, for example, right? So for us, that's sort of like what we see. And we were both laughing about this because Paul Triolo, who is one of the people we interviewed for the book, came up with this, you know, small gain, high cost, as opposed to small yard, high fence, which we wish we had for the book, because it's a brilliant analogy. But we're actually quite critical of the Biden administration.
What is the small gains there?
Well, like for us, from our perspective, like what has been really gained by U.S. export controls on technology. There's not a long list of wins, and in fact, you see this like with big impact to R&D budgets on private companies in the U.S. and technology that are losing that ability to continue to invest in maintaining tech advantage. Where, to Ansgar's point, before you had very expensive semiconductor funds in China that basically were driven more or less by in Fund 1 and Fund 2. Because if you're a Chinese SOE, why would you bother buying Chinese tech if you could buy NVIDIA? NVIDIA chips are the best. So even if you have a government that you should consider buying more Chinese, you're going to buy the best. all of a sudden, if that choice is removed, you're going to go back to the Chinese semiconductor companies and you're going to say, guys, we're going to need to like get our act together now because we don't have that choice anymore. Double damaging. You have encouraged Chinese innovation and you have hurt R&D.
That's right.
And so, like from a Chinese perspective, and I think really important to feel is like missed in particular. And Helen, you're an expert on this. I spent some time in China as well. I think like the first myth that we would like to dispel, and we spent some pages in the book about this, is sort of the accession to WTO. It's always presented here in the U.S. that like China tricked the U.S. somehow into the WTO business for that.
Right.
And in a huge domestic political debate on whether they should. Li Peng, who was like the Chinese like communist princeling, lost the premiership to Zhu Rongji, and they were fighting it out between the two of them. Zhu Rongji didn't feel like he could get enough reform, and so used the WTO to essentially drive more political reform. So actually, from a Chinese perspective, the incentive behind WTO was not this sort of like long-term marathon scheme to trick the U.S. to drive domestic economic reform in China. And then you've seen a lot of changes recently in industrial. And so at one point you had China be the quote-unquote defender of globalization. That was in Trump Point 1, where Xi gave this big speech in the World Economic Forum, where he sort of stood up and say, if you is retreating, China will step in. We see the same dynamic happening. The problem for China has been then this balance between control and growth. And so after this speech, see a lot of really poor moves by the Chinese government, starting with a crackdown on the domestic tech sector that it had been promoting as part of One Belt, One Road. And then you secondarily have zero COVID policy that basically destroyed the economy. And so now you have Chinese government that's struggling, maintaining tight political control, economic growth, and having a huge challenge around that. So today, you have Trump 2.0, and you have all this unfolding. What still is not clear from our perspective in terms of U.S. is what does the U.S. achieve with China? What would it like to see China do more or less of? Mm-hmm. Clearly articulating that. On the China side, shifting away, so much focused on control, and we talk a lot about some of the domestic policy vehicles that the CCP have been using around that, and then shifting towards growth. The problem with the current Trump administration's approach is it used to be that no one believed China saying like we're again open for business after these crackdowns. There's a huge disbelief in international business operating inside of China wanting to invest in China anymore because frankly they didn't believe the Chinese. They knew they're going to double down on growth. And what you're seeing now with the current administration's approach is they've essentially given China a new avenue, a new opportunity to position itself as sort of quote-unquote defender of globalization.
And that only 2.0. Wow.
Yes.
Okay. I can't wait to see what unfolds in the next little while. I want to bring us back to the corporations, Owanska, because I know you had mentioned this and the role of corporations in all of this, because these high-level, government-to-government discussions are often missed at the sort of corporations, business-to-business level. Now, over the last 4 years, we've seen AmCham, the American Chamber of Commerce, really pull out of China, right? And journalists, American students, American businesses really kind of pulling out of that market and either relocating to other parts of Southeast Asia, North Asia, or elsewhere, right, in the UAE or other parts of the Middle East. So, Ansa, can you tell the audience here, or just tell us, how businesses and corporations have actually navigated all this, and what does geopolitics and its impact look like for a corporation and corporate perspective?
Sure. Yeah,
Not good is a vibe, I think.
So we basically report from our own experience, right?
Yeah.
So we were both on the same team at HP when the first Trump administration actually started the 301 tariffs, etc., pp. So we were responsible for, trying to deal with it on a short-term, very tactical level of just trying to get, the PCs and the printers into the US without paying prohibitive tariffs. But then also think about it long-term, like how do we need to set up the corporation long-term in order to be more resilient in geopolitical terms. And I think from my perspective, it's a little bit like an iceberg, right? So on the top level, you have basically geopolitical crisis events. Something is happening and you need to react immediately.
Trump issuing tariffs or...
Exactly, some tariffs are dropped, or you have some disturbance, like, some crisis in the...
Right.
in the
an
in
executive
the south.
order or something
Something like that, or even an incident around ships colliding and it spins into the crisis. That's basically where corporations have something they call like business continuity management, BCM, as a kind of a short-term tactical response, right? And that's very much about like shuffling around supplies and, huge dashboards and many monitors and people frantically, calling suppliers and that kind of stuff. So that's the one part, which is literally from my perspective, that's the small part that's above water, right? And corporations are usually pretty good at doing this, right? It's in the end, HP was a big logistics company to some degree. Then you have a middle layer, which is what we call Geotech statecraft. And that's what Nick already mentioned. That's basically the attempt to weaponize tech supply chains for geopolitical purposes, right? It's interesting because it's a response from governments to globalization, right? If the supply chains are global, you try to basically leverage these supply chains for your own purposes, right? This is what we do in ESG, by the way, right? So you follow the supply chain and you make corporations responsible for your political agenda in their supply chain, no matter where it's located. And that's basically the same logic that governments are now applying in order to pursue their geopolitical goals. On an abstract level, you could argue this is an attempt of internalizing the negative externalities of tech dissemination to your geopolitical goals, right?
Which China has done very well, by the way, because they have state-owned enterprises, right, and sort of top-down approaches to this. But the West doesn't have that.
Historically, that's the normal, right?
Right.
So governments always try to limit or control, steer the dissemination of technology according to 9th century swords were export controlled in the Carolingian Empire. Vice versa, this is what Newman and Farrell actually highlight in their book, Underground Empire. Sometimes there are cases where governments try to promote the dissemination of technology if it serves their purposes. If everybody's communicating on the internet, which is dominated by US tech, well, guess what? US foreign policy is in favor of pushing out these technologies.
Yeah.
And what we've seen over the last years is a complete reversal of that position. Back then, it was like you have a problem in Saudi Arabia, you call US State Department as a US corporation, they will help you. Today, it's a very different game, right? They rather call you and say, like, here anymore because we don't want this technology. And why? So US making with regard to controlling the dissemination of technology has done a 180-degree turn. And corporations now need to deal with it. And in particular, US companies are not used to that kind of game, right? Because the US government was usually on their side, except for specific military goods or dual use or whatever. But our government is a friend of US tech selling abroad. And that is changing. By the way, if you look at history, Great Britain, 19th century, in London, it was exactly the same situation. The British government was concerned about the rise of Germany. British companies were very happy to do business abroad with German companies. So you see this split between the agenda of the government in the hegemon country and the corporations when there is a competitor rising. Companies still want to do trade, even with the geopolitical competitor, while the hegemon's government is concerned. This is exactly where we are right now here in the US. And this is what we felt actually when we worked at HP, right? And corporations now need to somewhat deal with this geotech statecraft. In practice, that's a whole catalog of tools, export controls, import controls, investment controls, you name it, ICTS, connected vehicles, entity bans, the Huawei saga, etc., pp, data localization requirements. All these are basically tools to somewhat steer the technology in the direction that you actually perceive as in accordance with your geopolitical agenda. That's the middle level, and that's keeping corporations insanely busy. Honestly, corporations haven't had the muscle to actually deal with the amount of new stuff over the last years. And the third level, that's literally the lowest level of the iceberg, and probably the most to deal with, is what we call the IT stack. And what we think is that politics is fundamentally changing the development of technology. On an abstract level, you could argue over the last 30 years, we basically worldwide. Few chips, same operating systems available everywhere. We thought because it wants to be global. That was a stack polar moment, and it was dominated by technology because US was the dominant power. Now that we enter a more bipolarish world, we see that the IST stack following basic political means is developing its own of US, independent of US vendors. And we the book at length becoming an alternative compute architecture to become independent from ARM or x86 chips. And we go all the way up to the application level where basically the split in two world. This has plenty of political concepts, but it's also fundamental strategic questions that all big tech companies right now are facing, be it corporation, automotive space, or in IoT and computing. And that basically means stack in the Chinese or is the rest need to that's a one and yet so
yeah.
On semiconductor image stuff basically with are some will in China because they cannot afford not to, and some will basically exit China because it's becoming too complex, too expensive. Also means that corporations who go all in China will try to insulate their operations in China as much as they can from the rest of the corporation. So ironically, corporations then also become bipolar, right?
Yeah.
So you will have one China business almost independent from restaurants simply because you want to minimize the links where you can actually be, where you're vulnerable to Geotech statecraft, to export controls on IP, deemed exports, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And I think what's missing from this discussion is also what consumers want, right? I think we've seen from all sorts of technologies ranging from EVs to sort of, the handheld devices and tablets and things like this. What do consumers want? And I don't think there's enough feedback loop yet, particularly in the global south or global majority, on what that looks like. So I'm really curious to see where that goes. I mean, just as an aside for those, when I was working at Google, I remember I had to do a presentation about where the market was headed, right? And there were two polar bears fighting on an ice. One was Google, one was Meta. And I was like, guys, it's not about these two polar bears. The ice is melting. And that's what's happening with the geopolitical picture of bifurcation of China. Now, we've talked a lot about those two countries. I do want to bring the attention back to the rest of the world and what this dynamic means for all of us here in this room, those listening, and this country and China going forward. What does this mean going forward? What can you talk us through the next sort of 6 to 12 months? I fear sort of projecting any further because at the rate things change these days, things move quickly.
I think that's smart. And we used to do this, and to some extent are still doing this. So maybe initially on you and broader, right? So what you'll see now, you have the president ramping up tariffs clearly in sort of an attempt to perhaps from a PR perspective manage the fact that you walk back the tariffs on the rest of the world. but also in part because there's a real desire with administration, continued from the previous administrations, I should say, in quote unquote dealing with China. I think the main thing that a lot of folks in DC are missing is sort of the Chinese response.
Right.
I think the thinking through how the Chinese will act, and also understanding that the Chinese have learned from Trump 1.0 through to today in terms of what they need to do. And I think Xi is also in a different position than he was back in the day. And I think that's...
How so? Can you explain?
So in a couple ways, you see recently now there's been a new sort of corruption drive in PLA. That has been a continuation of CCP leadership under Xi. You have much more party ideology. As we talked about, where after zero COVID, after the tech crackdown, where there was a real concern inside of China about macroeconomics, and there was a real concern in particular with AI, that sort of China had quote unquote missed the boat. I think now with DeepSeek, with Manus and other things, there's sort of a sentiment that maybe we have figured this out. You saw there's the kiss of the ring for Jack Ma coming back up on stage with a number of other Chinese tech leaders in with Xi, and I think there's a real push towards moving the needle back from control, maybe a bit more towards growth, firstly. I think secondly, there's also how to deal with the president. And I think for perspective, you see this with TikTok. To me, the discussion around what should we do about TikTok, and then not thinking through whether the Chinese government or not will allow that deal to go through, is not doing your job right. And I think you've seen that now with, they had a deal on TikTok that would have been beneficial from a U.S. national security perspective, from an economic perspective, that the Chinese walked away in part because of the increase on refund tariffs. And I think you're seeing now the White House trying to send signals to China, if only you will call us and ask for a meeting, we can then set up some deal time, but you have to call us so that we can say that, you know, the Chinese, if it worked, the Chinese called us to make a deal. It's sort of like, and on the Chinese side, you're like, they're don't need to, and they spent the last 10 years trying to make themselves more independent from U.S. tech. And so I think that's sort of the challenge. And so my personal prediction in the next 6 to 12 months, or from my individual perspective, you're going to see a lot of noise, a bit similar to what you saw under Trump 1.0, and then you're going to have an announcement. I think look at what would the result of that be. People forgotten that we had this whole show that was our lives for 2.5 years. Every weekend, I can't mention the times I got called out from like brunch with my wife on a weekend because the president had tweeted something about tariffs, and we need to. That was 2 years of my life. That was pretty intense. And people have forgotten. There was a whole deal that U.S. and China in order to sort of agree and make Chinese commitments towards bringing down the trade deficit. Where are we today? Unprecedentedly high. So my prediction, you will see the same thing. The Chinese have learned to navigate this. They have a bit longer lens. I think the more interesting bit will be what will happen with the rest of the world. And this is partly why we think the Cold War analogy is interesting, because people always focus when they say, oh, but Cold War is overused. It's not the same. China and the U.S. is way more interconnected than the Soviet Union and the U.S. used to be. That's true. And it's sort of like, it's a lot more intense and dynamic today. The Cold War was pretty dynamic, and there was a huge movement of non-aligned countries that very much was in the middle of that. And you're seeing that today. You're seeing push and pull in countries like India, in Singapore, in UAE. Our argument is the position, the government perspective in these non-aligned countries to sort of be, we will play in both stacks. That strategy will come untenable. And UAE is a great example of a government that has kind of declared allegiance towards the U.S. recently.
Yeah, and had to divest all the Chinese interests, right?
And I think that you will see more countries trying to maintain and even from being that bridge, playing in both, our claim will become expensive with too little yield. You have to declare one or the other. Interestingly, as two Europeans who have spent a lot in DC, Europe is having a moment of now we're going to have European tech startups. I can say personally, we have the way that I talked about Greenland being a bad country that calls the U.S. NATO ambassador after the country with the highest number of capita in Iraq and Afghanistan, having been a bad ally did not sit well with a lot of folks. And I will say that drive is now manifesting in literally cutting American products, who are very not cutting systemic tech being potential threat of having tariffs put on services. By the way, the deficit is to the benefit.
Exactly.
And just forgets time deficit. But I think that is a huge challenge right now for companies where they're worried about this. Our argument, though, is if you look at the tech stack, the way the IT from as an architecture, commodities, factors, application layer, in tech stack is and so the capital, the capex investment required security, the huge transformation of industrial policy in order to achieve a quote-unquote truly European tech stack is enormous. We're talking CHIPS Act times a gazillion. And so for us, that will be really, really difficult. Being a little bit more coy with China, I think there's an understanding that that's not the long-term strategic bet either. But I think there's sort of, okay, if we're being received less well in Washington, D.C., maybe we try to reinvigorate some of the relationships there. And you're seeing, interestingly, a new FTA between potentially EU and from my perspective, is that attempt of trying to yourself in between. But a quote-unquote independent IT stack, we don't see it anywhere else other than US-led Western IT stack and a Chinese IT stack.
Where do you think Europe will sort of try and innovate, though? Is there anywhere that they can sort of pull ahead? And maybe you can talk to this and also that I asked too.
I think I completely agree with Nick. When you seriously talk numbers, right? If you think about like Eurostack, European invest, just the money you would need to create an alternative dependent on US intellectual, seriously. Investment plans that would one be because the market for it's like this kind without getting challenged and knowing them on numbers. I see perspective. By the way, be the name me a company who wouldn't be when you step fundamental trigger the big now to and adapt to geopolitical. Decision makers out go around. Fundamentally, see Europe's role is to be part of the West. Be part of it's not going to. The strategy of Europe needs to tune to that, and it's going to be a different strategy than vis-a-vis China. US technological sovereignty doesn't make sense, right? If it's two different things, you have to have two different names. We don't even have that in Europe, right? Everything is technological sovereignty right now. So my high-level perspective is, if you are part of the Western IT stack and it's still dominated by the US, you need to focus on that relationship and think about how to become less vulnerable within that relationship. So it's interdependence management. That's basically the exercise that you need to focus on. And instead of, let's say, trying to minimize or whatever from this IT stack with no alternative, my recommendation would be actually can afford really to hurt you badly, right? I'm not saying like the best insurance company that Europe has is that 50-60% of US companies are using SAP software,
Yes.
right?
Me included. It's a great software.
Everybody uses it. So if you switch that off, the kill switch debate, it would hurt. So you rather not, you know. And I think my recommendation to Europe would therefore be you should focus on innovation and becoming really, really good in stuff that no US company can afford not to have. That's
Both on the hardware and the software.
both on the hardware and the
Yeah.
software side. This is where you need to focus on, and this actually also makes tons of sense from a wealth perspective, wealth creation perspective, etc. PP, becoming defensive than trying to rip out technology and replace it with something probably inferior. That doesn't make sense economically, and I'm highly encouraging Europe to look through the smoke, and it's hard to, but still you should see the US relationship as on a fundamentally different level than the strategic competition with China. And I was telling you, like, Nick and I spent long years on trying big tech in Europe, right? We work for Escom, I work for HP, Zoom, Hewlett-Packard. We tried to sell the value of US tech in Europe. That was our core job. Value is really difficult because the position is somewhat, you know, actually tell you like the recent case of like the, I think it was with Maxar and this imagery services. Basically, US governments have contract firm, but it frantic debate in Europe about the hypothetical switch that retailers that's policy now in Europe, and we do not really have good answers. What do you think? Is it a real risk, or the sales pitch in that regard? And it's to me it's this kind of out of you. Factored in, of course, because it's literally currently, and it's becoming more and more difficult. Sales guy, Europe, and trying to
It must be, you know, are trying to sort of, you know, make the US sit up and take notice of this, or this current administration. I do want to make sure we've got enough time for questions, but before I turn over to the audience, so please have your questions ready. I do want to come back to your point, Asker, earlier, and I want to make sure the audience understands this, because it's a really important point, 2 points that you two things that are missing from the game and people fundamentally misunderstand is China's domestic decision-making process, as well as this idea of innovation and being able to choke down innovation. So can you just quickly expand on those 2 points, and then we'll take some audience questions.
Sure. So I think there's the fundamental misunderstanding of how innovation actually happens. The bubble innovation. So one part of the chain that is in control of one singular, and you basically press on that company and you basically say, like, you don't export anymore. Happened with NVIDIA chips or with ASML machines. Then down the other side, not be able to innovate anymore. Right? That's linear. Throw and water kind of idea. We looked at this idea even back at HP, right? In 2018-19, we were discussing the scenarios, and we talked to technologists. They were just like,
"That's not how
literally
it
telling you
works."
that this is a crazy idea, right?
Yeah.
We as technologies, for us, these constraints that you are creating here, that's the food that we live on, right? This is basically, if you have a constraint like this and it needs to be solved, we as technologies, we get the money that we need to actually solve it. So what you are doing is basically, that's catnip for innovation. And exactly this happened in China, right? So you introduced a constraint, and that is the focal point then of innovation. And as Nick explained, what's really moving the innovation ecosystem in China, of course, is when you have the big players, the big guys who really know what they're doing, like Alibaba, Tencent, and all the others, Baidu, BYD, when they have a constraint and they turn around to the system and say, like, you better get going because we need you, and we're not going to be able to buy NVIDIA chips, then stuff is happening in China. And completely a different kind of dynamic here. Usually read when you get the impression that everything is directed by Xi, right? So big semiconductor subvention programs, subsidy programs, corruption to the highest level, disaster, nothing came out of it, complete failure. Because they were top-down, you had graft, fake companies, etc. pp. Big Fund 3 will be a big success. Why? Because of US export controls. Semiconductor programs a success. That's crazy, right? That's exactly not what you want. So we think this whole idea is like it's contradictory and it's not serving your interest at all. Why? Because you have to how innovation actually works. And this is where I'm frustrated because you can get that feedback anytime when you talk to in US companies. They will all tell you the story, but they're not part of the discussion, and that's frustrating.
Hopefully that...
And this is the strategy that China is pursuing, recognizing the national legal value of diffusion of its tech.
Exactly.
And that is that the U.S. is doing when it's expensive.
Yeah.
And I think the one that's come out of all the months in the last couple of weeks, highlighting the cost, and we call this out in the book. I think to the consumer is sort of the underlying in all political debates when you say you want Europe, Chinese tech, who is willing to pay for it? Here, which government will pay extra money for made in America? Does anyone know? No one knows. It's not the U.S. federal government. It's not U.S. companies. Even in the U.S., our laws, it's structured in procurement and DOD to buy the cheapest in America until that there's a price to pay, or until we're willing to pay $3,500 for an iPhone instead of $1,000, or in Europe's case, 10,000 because we need to build up from the new European tech stack so we can have European equivalents of iPhones. We're not going to get.
I think everyone saw that meme of the flight leaving Cambodia with the last shipping phones before the tariffs hit. Now I'm going to get to the questions on. Please raise your hand. First one is from Georgetown University. Thanks for your question, Jake. So it seems to have been able to harness its state-owned enterprises to risk and leverage its tech advancements across government and industry. So what are the gaps between the US government and US tech industry, and what solutions are there to promote better public-private partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about the Chinese side in particular, and Ansgar, you should weigh in. Two things on that. The relationship between SOEs and Chinese government is sort of very complex, right? There's a lot of unwritten ways of supporting. There's a lot of access to capital benefits that sort of is never captured anywhere that is very close to it. The challenge, if you actually talk to Chinese, spend some time there, they have their same own complicated relationship with Chinese government.
Some things are universal.
Yes,
you know?
there was a FT article a couple years back about Chinese government, a directive, 红州维宪, like a red-headed letter document, a Communist Party directive that said we need to stop buying American tech. And most SOEs that you talk to are like, yeah, we're not going to do that. Because American products are still better.
Yeah.
And so it is more complicated than just the SOEs being in an extended, uniform, 100% aligned to the Chinese government arm. It is not. I think benefits is the close coordination, and I think where U.S. could do a better job is thinking in the business and the corporate perspective as they're pursuing these regulations. Chip export's a great example. You saw in October 2022, Biden administration issued a new threshold for chips controls of exported without a license.
Yeah.
NVIDIA, ARM, and Intel a month later released a new architecture that meant they could still continue to export without a license. That new architecture, I bet you, is a couple of lawyers that came up with a new memo that said, actually, it turns out our previous memo was wrong. And then it took the and probably like 75% of BIS capacity, but threshold lower Intel and NVIDIA a week to come up with that actually our new threshold is even lower and we can continue to sell without a license. And by the way, at the same time, you have bulk applications for continuing to sell. Huawei, for example, that's been sort of PR story is we took entity list actions against Huawei. Sales stopped to Huawei. That's not true. 95% of license applications to continue to sell to Huawei were approved by the BIS. There's been some great studies actually that applications from companies had more red-leaning states had a 10 plus percentage point favor of license applications. I would imagine that would be the same case for the new license applications that we're likely to see with tariffs and Trump. So I think lessons in terms of coordinating better. Importantly, though, it's important we don't become the reason why the U.S. has exceptional technological leadership. It's the capitalist system. And so I think really important that we don't sort of move over to a state-driven industrial policy and we copy Chinese policies because we are worried about it. The reason why we're in this technology leadership position we're in is because of the things like open, huge access to talent and capital, free-flowing ideas and being able to challenge those. And that's exactly the type of policies, the opposite policies that China with its tech crackdown, with its zero COVID policy, that caused huge economic challenges for China. And so if the US focused less on trying to trip up China and more on like just doing what we do, which is great, we would win in the long term.
Let me just add to that. I'm not a fan of all that public-private stuff because I saw corporations being literally strict term of really producing that they wouldn't have used if it were some government intervention that basically led astray. Right? It's public money comes with strings attached always, and it comes with a message, and it doesn't come with the and the experience that you have when money comes from VCs, from investors, etc. pp. So I fundamentally think public money for corporations is a risk, is a danger. And in Europe, it's particularly popular right now to think big about these kind of corporations, etc. pp. Companies ending up in basically in a dead-end street. They produce stuff that you can sell then to one government, right? And it was designed according to the wishes of this government that gave you the money, but it's in the commercial market. And then you've talent and people producing this one thing, and you become less, right? So and I'm just very, very, let's say, cautious when it comes to entering these schemes. And then we had all these big plans, this CHIPS Act, projects in Germany like Intel factory in Magdeburg, etc. pp. If you look at the reality on the ground, it's always basically waste. I'm not sure exactly we try to copy or take a page out of this book. China is with all its advantages and plenty of disadvantages. We have very critical basically assess that she system has, is a big risk to China's capacity to overcome the middle income trap, right? She is a real problem for Chinese economic development, to set that clear, but what we find interesting, it's a little bit like, again, back to the Cold War. In the end, when Cannon formulated containment strategy, that you had this element of the Soviet Union, but what he was really saying that in the Cold War, our own strength, right? And it's how you are given, section between us and war seems connected. That guy over. It seems like the pendulum in the US has swung massively into the direction of thinking how to disturb China rather than really trying to focus on its own strength. And this is, we're from Europe, right? We look at it from the outside, we see the secret sauce that the US had, but it's the belief that will lead to success. And we clearly believe in that. So in that regard, we are pretty retro with regard to the policy mix that you need to succeed.
Vintage, I think.
Yes.
I think, you see that America First idea permeating through a lot of the funds from Silicon now, especially things like General Catalyst, America Frontier Fund, places like that I think are now drive that and trying to sort of bring that back to America being exceptional and actually demonstrating by being competitive.
Yeah.
I want to check with the organizers how much time we've got because I was 15. Okay, great, plenty of time. So one audience question here, and then I think I want to get to one here because it's on AI and it's my favorite topic.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself too.
My name is Mark. I'm from United Daily News, we're based in Taiwan. So my question is, NVIDIA huge investment deal to the United States this morning, building a huge United States. I'm just to see and do you the from there so how make this national strategy as trying to semiconductor it seems is still expensive. So do you think Taiwan is on an industry view?
One expandable now. I mean that's the journey that we see, right? So reflecting the geopolitical naivety of IT and tech industry, we build basically value chains and supply chains that run right through the geopolitically most volatile regions in the world, right? It's just joking to Nick. It's just like sending people through the worst neighborhoods in the city is basically how we build value.
And tectonic activities as well.
And tectonic activities as well. So in the end, zero consideration for resilience, all consideration for efficiency led us to a setup where you have on several parts of the value chain high concentration of vendors, literally sometimes two, Ellen stuff, and in a one basket in a region that's geopolitically fraught. So, and if you look at what Taiwan offers to the tech industry with regard to manufacturing capacities in the wafer space, etc., pp. There is no alternative. And the truth is, if you take away the political rhetoric of everybody talking about CHIPS Act and investments in the US, everybody in the tech industry knows for the next 20 years, this will be the case. That's the reality. And if you do not face that, you will make... If you think that we can de-risk Taiwan within 5 years until 2027, I don't know what, you're mistaken. Not going to happen. That's the reality. And if you think about, you look at the scenarios for what would a hot conflict around Taiwan mean for P, it's an absolute disaster. Absolute disaster. That's so, we are very actually really comes to for the volatility, close escalation. So we might think there's just too much activity in the region with regard to navies and whatever, and not enough stable ways of communicating, making sure that there's a way to off-ramp an escalation. We don't have around it, so when something is happening there, there's a high risk from escalation. Worry.
Anything to add? Okay, might take this question.
Are Trump's policy de-risk?
Supply chain come to the U.S. as part of diversity strategy?
I think that's part of it, but again, I think one of the things that we call out in the book is that we also want to see that realized, right? You have the example of Wisconsin, how much of that was actually built?
Right.
And so for us, it's sort of like having been a little bit in the game, you know, what you say when you have the White House announcement and then what is actually built like 5-10 years later. The length that it would take to set that up would surpass a third term for the president. My challenge is that commitment still there if the political reality in the U.S. changes. I think on specifically on Taiwan though, and I think for me as someone that spent a lot of time thinking about Chinese policy in this space too, I think in the U.S. there's often this like 27 analogy that particular, you know, military planning and intelligence organizations love, because then it's like there's a specific date, and then after that we can put a X% likelihood that there will be a conflict, referring to commitments made by Xi. My view is, from a Chinese government perspective, a scenario is much more likely. You have slow elite co-option inside. You have a business interest continuing to be more. You have continued investment in political influence in the region. To me, that scenario, long-term shifting towards improved relationships with mainland, much more likely. Conflict, the problem around a hot conflict, to Ansgar's point, the results would be so devastating. And right now, the lines of communication are not that great in order to sort of evade. If you look back again using technology, some reads, you know, the Tom Schellinger post that they actually got to potentially devastating conflict, so, that changed. And if the communication now, just on a serious security situation that was escalating, not just between China, but also with Taiwan, own decision-making process.
Yep. Answer this one question and then get here in the audience. From Sharik Zafat, this there's no conversation in DC on tech goes by without mentioning of AI. So this is on AI, artificial intelligence. The US government approach be towards open source AI models in light of DeepSeek, Manus, etc. So for those who probably are not familiar, DeepSeek and Manus are open source large language models that I think a lot in the US were kind of caught or surprised by. But I know you guys weren't, so please feel free to weigh in here.
We called it out just that here personal. I think from an AI perspective, first it's important to define what we mean by open. Everyone's throwing source, yet it's training data for a good reason, and that training data, as someone that's played around with it on a virtual machine, very clearly is impacted by Chinese government censorship. That's why you can get it to not say things. But I think the benefit from, if you think about from enterprise perspective, does it matter what the chatbots respond to June? An SME, it does not, right? And so there's some benefits to that. I think the other thing from an open source perspective is, Ansgar has talked about this, is RISC-V, an open source architecture for compute. That's a whole different story. And then finally, really importantly, security. We've seen a number of issues related to open source security. And I think a lot of times people say, well, if it's open source, then anyone can go in and test it, and that way it will be secure. If you actually work with the companies that does that, they do not necessarily do extensive security testing before they inject open source software into a supply chain. And so it creates huge, huge security issues if we don't do a better job around protecting the platforms that enable it, but also making people more aware of what are the steps they need to take to do it. I think companies when we was in the company that were using eventually a world leader, create period for these spaces. There's a both day from an thinking about recommit to open source. I just think talking on what we mean with open source. Is it open weights? Is it open everything? Right, there's not a lot of quote-unquote truly open source models out.
Maybe just
Go ahead, yeah.
one meta perspective on, I think, tendency open kind of a haven in a fraud world. I think that's open source geopolitics because the problematic than for proprietary technology. So who's going to make sure that some open not systematic geopolitical and use that technology? Everybody could really. No one's actually going to do it. Create them, right? Already that is already the problem, right? So, Mike Gallagher went out with statements. Basically, risk factors cannot be because a leakage of the China on the classical level because, right? As to prevent actually using risk 5 in order to catch up. So I think it's imminent that you will see a crackdown on statecraft and that there will be around open source. And it's pretty easy to do actually. So what we saw with the Huawei case in 2019 was that controls basically established. Huawei was put on the end tool and corporate entities export control. And that basically not only selling to Huawei, and also right at some potential control me promoting so needs on you and that's and it's so is could and from Geotech.
And
thank you, Jenna. You a lot there, like Europe and to the market interdependent in different period and Europe being a bit more
Ukraine as well.
I can take a quick stab of that. So, good response to the previous question on public-private partnerships, right? Where you could have the part of the challenge for a lot of European startups is access to cheap capital, and so this is where you could see a role between and having on the ground. I think Europe as a researcher for procurement, not EU, and so we might be a more aligned capability. There's really offensive. We will start great and familiar. I surround the building the quote-unquote independent stack. If we have to not only coordinate our procurement, but then also make sure that we have only European capital and can buy only European, that gets challenging. If we recognize the coordination challenge in procurement, but we maintain the allied approach and, for example, can leverage access to capital in the US, can leverage access to US defense primes, and can complement that with European innovation systems and small and medium-sized businesses focused, to Ansgar's point, on making yourself invaluable in parts of that chain, I think hugely important. The last thing I'll just say is it's very clearly, and this is something that maybe we've criticized sort of the debate in DC a lot. I will also say the debate in Brussels, there is silent recognition, but not outspoken recognition. We have benefited a lot from the peace dividend in the last 50 years in Europe. One that straddles both a European identity and an American identity. For me, it's great to see that there's I'm whether that be followed by.
Excellent. On that note, we might have to leave it there. My last plug is also for you all to sign up for Intrigue at International, which also in between and Sky. So thank you.